Welcome back to another very special episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. Today we have a interview subject. There's really no way to describe this other than if you played video games in the first decade and a half of their mass market appeal, be it as a handheld electronic game, be it as a home computer game, or even later on as a handheld cartridge system, this man has played a part in that story, in that experience. He was there at some of the most pivotal moments. He was the guy that companies went to when they needed to change their approach to this market. This, listeners, is Michael Katz. Michael, welcome to the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
Thank you, Karl. Nice to be here.
Excellent. Same here. So, now, before we get into the meat of it, you did not start out after college wanting to, or you didn't start out in the toy business, in the electronics and the computer game business. Where did you start out?
I was in the Army for 2 years after my undergraduate college and was lucky enough to get an assignment in California near San Francisco at the time when the Vietnam conflict was starting, basically, when would it have been? In the 60s in America and Vietnam. I returned to civilian life after 2 years of a fairly plush Army experience. I was not overseas. I was not shot at. And I went to business school at Columbia and concentrated in marketing. I had been interested in retailing when I was growing up because my family, mother, father, were in retailing. They were at Macy's and Gimbels. I'm sure you've heard of Macy's, but Gimbels no longer exists. They used to compete. My sister was on the Macy's training program and had a career in retailing. And I was always interested in merchandise and window shopping and determining how products changed, how they were introduced, what the trends were. And I remember on weekends in Manhattan, where I grew up and lived, I would like to walk down to 50 or 60 blocks to Lower Fifth Avenue and look in the windows at Saks Fifth Avenue and Lord & Taylor and Von Martella and Bloomingdale's and Macy's and just check out the action at retail. So I had sort of a built-in interest in merchandise and in retailing, partially because of my parents and just partially, I guess, because I liked it. So at Columbia, there was no retail concentration. The closest thing was marketing. And I learned that marketing meant instead of working at a department store or department store chain as a buyer and then a merchandise manager, marketing involved national products, mostly in the food and consumer products and grocery products field. Companies like Procter & Gamble and Colgate and Lever Brothers and General Foods and Gillette and Coca-Cola and Pepsi. And what it meant was if you wanted to be a marketing person dealing with new products, what to develop, doing the research on what was needed, what consumers liked and didn't like, and then doing the product development from a marketing standpoint, doing the advertising, the naming, the packaging, promotion, PR, all of that appealed to me, and it was as close to retailing as any other concentration would be. Most of the guys at Columbia in those days and since then, of course, were influenced by the easy money on Wall Street. And I'd say 70% of the classes, and probably continuing into today, had people wanting to get involved with finance and go to Wall Street and be, big wheels in the financial industry. But I was a product guy like several of my friends and felt building a product and selling something was a lot more interesting than selling shares of stock and dealing with pieces of paper. So I concentrated in marketing. I was at Columbia Graduate School for an accelerated program. When I got out, I interviewed at ad agencies and consumer products companies. I had an offer to go to work for Leo Burnett, which is one of the leading advertising agencies at the time located in Chicago, headquarters-wise. I had an offer from Bloomingdale's to be on their MBA program, accelerated program. That was my key offer from retailing. And then I was offered a product management job, which is the term that was you would go into if you were in marketing, brand management, product management. And I had an offer from Lever Brothers. I had an offer from Hershey Foods, Hershey Chocolates at the time, and probably a few other companies. So I chose Lever Brothers. I became a assistant product manager, then product manager on some of Lever Brothers, now Unilever, some of their detergent brands, during which we competed with Procter & Gamble's similar brands. And it was all about having multi-million-dollar ad budgets, promotion budgets, marketing budgets, deciding, what the next year's product should be, working with ad agencies to develop the advertising, mostly TV and radio, and then managing everything about marketing in the product area. The path to running some of these companies in those days, and maybe still, was a marketing path. And what most of the younger marketing people would do is take a brand management or product management job at one of these companies. And at some time in their first 5 to 10 years, they would also work at an ad agency as an account manager or an account supervisor to get both sides of the fence, marketing from the point of view of the company and advertising and marketing from the point of view of an ad agency. So that was the path that a lot of people took. And I took that path too. But my major goal after a few years at Lever Brothers was different from a lot of people because geography is important to me. And I loved Northern California. I'd been there in the Army, and I wanted to try to, get a job in marketing in San Francisco, which was very unusual in terms of availability of marketing jobs because San Francisco at the time was known for basically 3 categories of products. The wine business, with Gallo Winery being nearby, United Vintners that owned Italian Swiss Colony in Inglenook, and Napa Valley was the bastion of Northern California and of United States wine. So there was the wine business. There was, to some extent, the food business because Del Monte and Dole were headquartered in San Francisco. There was some coffee business, Folgers and Hill Brothers, and there was banking, Wells Fargo, Bank of America. But it was not really a bastion at that time for the largest consumer products, grocery products companies. There was no Silicon Valley. It was a quaint, charming, small city. And boy, has it changed in the last 30 years. But it was great. And I wanted to, make that at least temporarily my home. And so I needed to find a marketing job where they would value experience at a Lever Brothers and where they were looking for MBAs to go into their marketing company. So I actually joined a company called Foremost, which was a dairy company, later to be part of Foremost McKesson, because Foremost merged with McKesson, the giant drug and other company. And why Foremost? Because a former Lever Brothers guy had gone to Foremost to start a grocery products division to get them broader than just the dairy business. He hired a guy from New York who was a marketing guy who had been at Cornell and Columbia Business School. And so there was a coincidence there. And he was the marketing director. And they wanted a marketing manager with similar background. And I had the right resume for, which is often important because I had the educational background and came from New York, like the guy who became my boss. And the guy who was running the show had been at Lever Brothers, and I was currently at Lever Brothers. So I got the job that brought me to San Francisco. And ultimately, when Foremost decided not to try to become a full-fledged General Foods or Procter & Gamble. I went to McCann Erickson, the ad agency, because once again, I was on this career path that most marketing guys and gals took. And at McCann Erickson, I became an account executive, then an account supervisor. With food products, I brought Foremost, which still had some business, in as a client. And I worked on United Vintners, the wine company, even though I don't drink wine, don't like wine, and it wasn't wine, and it wasn't real well suited. But I was getting the advertising agency experience. And any creative marketing person, I believe I can say this safely, would be frustrated just being an account person at an ad agency, because you don't do the creative work yourself. You don't have automatic input to the advertising process. That's all handled by the creative department, which is made up of artists and copywriters, and the account people just basically are marketing advisors to their clients and carry the advertising over to the clients to try to get it approved. So it's not the creative side of advertising. So I was there for 3 years for experience, working on several of the accounts, bringing in some new business. I didn't like it. It was just sort of an interim step for me to take. The phone from Mattel rang twice while I was, I guess, at McCann. Early on, someone talked to me about joining Mattel, but I wasn't interested. I was in San Francisco, Mattel was in LA, and I guess it didn't sound right, and I had just joined McCann. Several years later, when the phone rang, and it was the executive search recruiter that Mattel used for higher level marketing positions, I listened. It sounded intriguing, and the story was that Mattel, which had a lot of gut-smart guys who had no disciplined, formal marketing background, neither at graduate schools or in consumer products companies, which is where people looked for learning the basics of real disciplined, planned marketing, strategic marketing. The Mattel board and the Mattel management, which were not those kinds of people, said, we've got to get more discipline. We've got to get, more 20th century, and we need to hire, some experienced consumer packaged goods people and get them into the marketing department. And we're creating a new area called new product categories. And we need someone to be the first marketing manager in the new product categories. And the new product categories meant.
Sorry. What year was this?
This was 1975.
Okay. Sorry. Just putting it in perspective in my head. Yeah. Please continue.
Yeah, this was 1975. So basically, the role of the new product, the new product category division or area was to try to get Mattel into one categories that they tried to get into and failed, or had never tried to get into, that were existing categories in the toy business. So that would be trucks to compete against Tonka, Buddy L, Ertl, Steel, children's trucks. It was action vehicles, which was another category that Mattel had not tried to or been successful in. It was classic and kids action games against Milton Bradley and Parker Brothers, where Mattel had tried but not successfully and wanted to try again. And it was new product categories that included things like roller skates, which we dabbled with. We dabbled with something as extreme as electric motors for bicycles to make bicycles into electric bicycles, which turned out to be, as you'll agree, 30 years ahead of its time.
Yeah.
And I remember testing the prototype myself on the bike path in Venice, California, taking the prototypes to show to buyers at Kmart in Troy, Michigan on a February rainy, snowy night.
Oh.
And when I got there, the battery on the prototype had leaked the liquid. out of the battery. I had a presentation the next morning for the merchandise manager of Kmart, and it was a Sunday night. I had to find a gas station at 11 o'clock near Detroit, Michigan, where I could get a mechanic who could repair the battery and the motor for me so I could make the presentation.
Oh, my goodness.
So, it was a great job. I loved it, and that was my entree into the toy industry. I interviewed, I got the job, and along the way we tried to get into, with different levels of success, the new categories. And in those days, and I'll get to the handheld games in a minute, in those days, the key to making a successful toy doll or game product was you had about 10 retail outlets that controlled about 60% of all toy and game and doll distribution in the United States. So you had to get your new product not into the consumer's hand initially, but you had to get the key retailers to stock your products on the shelves. So you had to get Toys R Us, you had to get KB, you had to get Walmart, you had to get Penny's, you had to get Sears, you had to get several other large regional accounts. If you couldn't get, out of the 10, 7 or 8 accounts and those buyers and merchandise managers to stock your product, either new or existing, then you weren't going to get enough distribution to create enough sales and to make spending millions on advertising profitable and sensible, because you didn't have the potential, if you weren't on the shelves of these key retailers, to meet your forecast and sell the amount of products you needed to have a hit product. That's something a lot of people don't understand. Clearly, young people today would not understand, because brick and mortar retailers are on the back burner in terms of everyone's mind these days. But, like going online on Amazon or wherever, or the retail accounts that have online presence, and looking at their toy catalog online, as you might recall, because you come from the States, growing up, you would look forward to getting the Penny's or the Sears Christmas catalog every October or November. And our replacement for that 30 years later is e-commerce and shopping online. So that was how you got your product recognized, awareness created, and got sales. So that's just an aside. Getting back to my job as the marketing director, I started as manager, then I became a director of this new category. My love at that time had been new products, because I had worked on new products at Lever Brothers, at Foremost, at the ad agency, blah, blah, blah. And so that was my interest. And I knew how to develop new product in terms of doing the research necessary initially, focus groups, quantitative research, ideation, testing new ideas, having focus groups, doing surveys, attacking the target audience, developing the positioning for the product, developing advertising strategies, copy strategies for the advertising, for the packaging, promotional programs, publicity programs. A lot of people don't understand the word marketing. Consumer products marketing is what I just described. Marketing is not sales. Sales is and was separate. You would have your sales force and sales directors. They would do nothing but go out and call on the key retail outlets, distributors as well, small retailers if that was the route that you took. But marketing was all about, what does the consumer want? How do we improve the current product? How do we come up with new products that meet the demand or could meet, the appeal of the consumer base that you're going after? So at Mattel, I would meet with different design groups, internal designers, actually toy and game and doll inventors who worked internally for Mattel in a department called preliminary design. That was the word, that was the phrase for Mattel's toy invention, doll invention, game invention department, preliminary design. And each area had a director and about 15 or 20 designers working for the director. So I would work with them depending on what new categories we were trying to get into. And there was one director named Richard Chang who was in charge of new product areas from a design standpoint. So in about excuse me, in about 1976 or 77, I had one of my usual meetings with Richard, and I said, Richard, you know, whether you know it or not, there's an electronic product out there now, not in the toy and game area, that everybody is finding magical, and I want you to build a handheld, portable game product, basically tying in with the direction that this electronic product has taken. So, Karl, my question to you is, what electronic product was in mass market distribution and was in just about everyone's hands between the ages of, let's say, 20 and 40 back in the early 70s?
It's got to be the calculator.
You are absolutely right. The handheld electronic calculator, LED based. So Richard took on the task, and about 2 weeks later.
Can I interrupt with just one question here? Because when you described what this department did, is try to find ways to get Mattel into toy markets that it wasn't in or hadn't been successful in before. When you're saying, hey, I want to go into a market that doesn't exist yet, it's one thing to say we're going to compete now in metal toy trucks or whatever. Did you have to get some kind of approval from on high to even start this research, or did you have enough autonomy at this point in this department to be able to initiate this, to go to prototype, even though there's no existing market niche that you're trying to fill?
Good question. It actually fell into the games category because I was asking for an electronic game, and but I did have good autonomy. I loved it actually. You know, at some point, there were weekly meetings with Ray Wagner for all of the marketing people and all of the design people for about 2 hours once a week, when prototypes and a brief marketing plan that outlined the strategy behind the product, the pricing, the profit picture, the target audience. At some point, all the products, including mine, would go before Ray, who had been the doll buyer at Sears before he was given a marketing job at Mattel and worked his way up to president of Mattel, a terrific, wonderful guy who unfortunately before Toy Fair about 15 years ago had a stroke while in his hotel getting ready for his day at Toy Fair and died. But he was a product guy from both retail, having been at Sears for 20 years as the toy buyer, toy game and doll buyer, and he joined Mattel, worked his way up, and a great guy, very knowledgeable. So he would chair a meeting once a week, I think it was, and each group, product group, dolls, toys, my groups, would present, if they were ready, a prototype and a marketing plan and positioning plan for each product, and it would get either the green light or a stop at that point. But you had to work your way up to that to be ready to make a presentation. And in my area, it was a lot of new products. So, you know, you wanted to have the products marketable toy or game ideas before you went to a meeting like that. So what Richard produced was a breadboard, as it's called, a prototype, an electronic board it was vertical, as you might recall, and it had LEDs that you were controlling with the joystick. You were represented by an LED, let's say, on the bottom of the screen, and in the prototype, your objective was to get to the top of the screen at the same time that enemy LEDs were coming down toward you. So it was an obstacle avoidance concept. you had to avoid the obstacles, LEDs coming down at you by moving your joystick as your LED moved up the screen, avoiding them and getting to the top. That was the play pattern. So question first was, is this fun? Is it sustaining? Is it game-like? Is it revolutionary? Yes. But would people like it in terms of the gameplay? And could it serve as a basis for a whole line of products?
One more question. Sorry. Go ahead. I was going to ask, since this is relatively new technology, how did your developers have the requisite technical skills and knowledge about electronics to make this at the time, or was there some kind of learning curve process where they're taking calculators apart to figure out how they work in order to get this prototype up and running?
Several of them were electrical engineers, whether they were in the design group or the engineering group. So I think they had the experience, and they knew the toy and game business, even though, Mattel hadn't been in the game business successfully. So they had imagination. So I think that answers your question.
Yeah, definitely.
But the project became, how do we test this with possible consumers? And what do we have to do between looking at this prototype, which just had LEDs moving up and down and avoiding obstacles? How is that a game? What's the game environment you put that into? So the next step was to imagine what this could be in real life, because a lot of people don't realize, and your listeners might get a kick out of this. When you think about toys and games, Karl, what it really is real life in miniature. Whether you're collecting soldiers, toy soldiers in the old days, lead soldiers, whether you're buying Hot Wheels cars, whether you're playing with a dollhouse, whether you're playing with a doll, think about it. That is real life in miniature. Yeah. And so the project here, like it has been historically, for the definition of any toy and doll and game design, real life in miniature, Sim City, products like that now in the electronics world. Pit Stop, which you played at Epyx probably.
Oh, Pit Stop too.
Anything.
So many hours. Yes.
Yeah, that was my concept, by the way. At any rate.
Don't worry. We will go over that in great detail. There's a laundry list of Epyx titles I have questions about. But
yeah,
yes,
I'm giving you probably too much detail on this, but I think it's probably really interesting.
No, this is fascinating.
How a toy company
this is
got
fascinating.
Into.
Yes. Please keep going.
So to accelerate a little, the next step had to be to do what we call B-sheets, which is a artist drawing, and we had plenty of artists at Mattel, of what the product could look like when it was a completed product. And so our imaginations and brainstorming among, the groups, the design group and me, were, okay, what could this action be in real life? So the action we decided could be football, and it could be a running back trying to avoid tacklers going from one end of the field to the other without getting knocked down. Another theme, auto race. And for this, we were using our imagination, but we also had the benefit of knowing about some popular coin-op arcade games that were in the arcades and that, had taken on thematic approaches too, shooting, driving, et cetera. So auto race made sense, and the theory there was you're in a car, you're trying to avoid cars, they're coming down at you, but that could be perceived as, you're trying to pass cars on a flat track. So auto race was another theme. I forget what the third and fourth themes were, but we developed drawings, colored drawings of the themes. We went to the target audience in focus groups, with 8 or 9 respondents and a moderator, which is still done or should be done in any kind of early product research. And we had the respondents, who I imagine were male, because we were going after the arcade video game customers at that point. Male, probably 12 to 20-year-olds, who played video games. And, they got to play in the focus group environment, the prototype, react to it. Then we showed them the B sheets, and they reacted to what themes they liked the most. Football, by the way, came out first. That was not the first product in the line because we were in a hurry to get a product out as quickly as we could to see if we could get widespread appeal for what we were doing with a large group of consumers. And we were ready with the molding and the engineering aspect of an auto race theme. So the first product in the Mattel handheld line was not Football 1. It was actually auto race.
Yeah.
So that's the genesis of Mattel entering the handheld category, my involvement in it. And, after I left Mattel, which I'll get into shortly, it became a line of many, many handhelds under the Mattel banner and led to Mattel Electronics, which was the division that then got formed that introduced Intellivision. I was asked whether I wanted to stay in my role of broad-based new product category marketing or whether I wanted to run the Intellivision division, which would have concentrated on marketing and introducing more handhelds and doing the introduction of Intellivision. I chose to stay where I was because I wanted to be involved in broad product areas, not just one, electronics. But at the same time, a company called Coleco, Connecticut Leather Company, if you didn't know what Coleco stood for, in West Hartford, Connecticut, had two brothers, Arnold and Leonard Greenberg, brothers of the founder, in a floundering semi-toy company called Coleco, famous for ride-on products like Big Wheels, famous for some outdoor pool products for people's backyards, and famous for some tabletop games like rocket hockey and stuff like that, but sort of floundering as a company and almost in bankruptcy. They decided to duplicate Mattel's handheld football game with a game called Electronic Quarterback, and they wanted to basically get into the whole electronic toy and game category. And I knew Arnold and Leonard from, just having been in the toy industry for several years. And so they approached me and asked if I wanted to become the first marketing vice president at Coleco and, concentrate on the electronics category, but be in charge of everything, and getting them back into a growth mode with new products. And the benefit, personally, was going to be that I'd be a vice president. I'd be in a first ever position for a company, and I would get a lot of stock options, because Coleco was public at the time, and options, if you know about them, go up as the company's stock goes up, and you vest options in those days a certain percentage every year. So if you have options for 100,000 shares, you probably vest 25,000 a year if you're still at the company, and you can quit whenever you want, and you vested a certain amount of stock that goes with you. So that was tempting.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I wanted to ask before we jump into Coleco.
So I took. Yeah.
Yeah. Before we jump into Coleco, with the handhelds, I wanted to ask, because it's in the games category, what was the internal calculus on how expensive this product could become? And how did it compare to other existing products in the games category at that time?
That's a great question. One of the big question marks was, what would people be willing to pay for, as you point out, this product? Basically, at that point, the magic price point for action games for kids and for board games was, I believe, under $10 or under $15 at retail. That's what the market price was. That's what the volume price was, meaning if you were priced under $10 for a kid's action game, under 15, but maybe under 10, I don't remember, for a board game like Monopoly or Scrabble or Stratego, then you were in the right ballpark price point-wise to do big volume and to have an ongoing franchise, assuming the products had sustaining year after year, decade after decade appeal. So we had to test the price points, which we tested in focus groups and quantitatively. It's all about, with new products, intent to purchase. But if you don't test intent to purchase at a particular price, you're not doing the right kind of research, because respondents will say they love a product. But when they hear how much the product costs, if it's too expensive, it doesn't matter what your score on intent to purchase is. So intent to purchase at a price point is key. So we did that kind of research. And I believe we came out with $29.95, if I'm not mistaken, as a safe retail price point. And to our pleasure, not surprise, but pleasure and hope, that was okay, because there was a magic behind the electronics. So people were willing to pay a lot more than was traditionally true. That was also a concern, obviously, of retailers. Sears and Walmart did not take the handheld products on initially. Walmart had a policy. They let other retailers test the new products. They don't want to get burned, and they're not in a hurry. And if the product turns out to be successful, at that time, Walmart was happy to come in year 2 or year 3 of a new product. In the case of Sears, which was an important category, the buyer, whose name was John Street, I'll remember it forever, thought that the product was not for him, was kind of a whim, and wouldn't have staying power. So they did not participate initially. But the other companies I've mentioned did, which gave us enough volume. And when the product took off, the volume was fine to sustain the kind of promotion, marketing, and advertising. And then everyone else came on board afterwards, including electronics outlets. So it broadened the game category.
And that was going to be another question. Did Mattel have any kind of existing distribution network outside of the toy industry, and what was the challenge of getting electronics stores and other stores interested in this product, or at least just creating the connections with them? Since I'm guessing, and you can tell me if I'm right or wrong on this, the product did end up skewing towards an older audience than maybe Mattel was used to appealing to.
True. I don't think that there were any, I don't think there were any electronic boutiques and GameStops back then. And I don't think there was Best Buy back then. No. But Mattel had special sales forces, and there was a special sales force, I believe, after I left, for the electronic products. But if there wasn't, Mattel had an internal sales organization, did not use reps. There was a vice president, then national sales director. There were regional sales managers. There were district sales managers. They had the ability to just call on, any kind of outlet, in which case it would have worked in this case. They would have just gone after, what was the big electronics store on 47th Street? Was it 40 something photo 47? There was Crazy Eddie, if you remember the name, as I recall, in New York. There were electronic stores, so they took the products on. Okay. So anyhow, yeah. Are you ready for Coleco? I'll make it fast.
I'm checking my internal list here of things, but I think we hit it all off. So you get the call from Coleco. This is after you know that the Intellivision product is on its way. Had it already been test marketed at the time that you left Mattel?
No.
Okay.
So I joined Coleco, and during the time I was there, we introduced electronic quarterback, and I think you and I emailed about this. It was ironic because my first week at Coleco as the first marketing VP, I was asked to approve, I forget whether it was a storyboard or a rough cut. I think it was a storyboard of the electronic quarterback TV commercial. And it was a hard-hitting, direct competitive commercial against Mattel's Football 1. So here I was, the guy who started handhelds at Mattel from a marketing standpoint, being at Coleco and being asked to approve a commercial that directly attacked the product line that I had developed from the company I just came from.
Oh, my goodness. And now, for those who aren't familiar with this ad, I will put a link to it in the show notes. This thing is basically gaming legend. I mean, I grew up hearing about it. I was a little too late to the party to have seen it. I grew up hearing about it, but it was one of the first things I found on YouTube years later. It's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah. It was developed by a small ad agency that Coleco was using called Richard and Edwards. They were the names of the founders of the agency. It was a small 10-person agency. And Edward, I forget his last name, was the brains behind it. He was the creative lead. And Richard was the head of the agency from a business and marketing standpoint. And it was brilliant. And that became the first, if I'm not mistaken, the first competitive TV commercial in the electronic game category. If the Plunkett in television commercials were considered, initial TV advertising, it wasn't until after this commercial. And, I don't think the Plunkett commercials were that hard hitting, compared to this one, or even compared to Genesis Does What Nintendo Don't, which we'll talk about later.
Oh, definitely.
Which was taking competitive advertising to another level. And by the way, doing something that the Japanese had up to that point as a nation, as a culture, considered inappropriate. You never do competitive commercials and knock someone else's product. We had to get around that cultural norm to get acceptance from the Japanese for the Genesis Does What Nintendo Don't hold marketing campaign. A lot of people don't know that.
Yeah.
So anyhow, we did the handhelds, we did head to head, we did, which I thought were adorable, the miniature tabletop games. There were 4 of them, and they looked like coin-op arcade games, but they were about 6 to 8 inches high, sat on a table. Are you familiar with them?
Yeah, these were the ones. I think it was there was a Frogger one, if I'm thinking of the right line.
Ms. Pac-Man.
Yes.
Exactly.
Now, how did the licensing
Frogger,
on
Ms.
those
Pac-Man.
work? How did you? Were you involved in acquiring the licenses, or was all that already in place when you came over to Coleco?
They had to be acquired, and that's an interesting story, which I'll get into in a minute. So we had these products. We had the electronic quarterback head to head and the miniature arcade games, and basically to do them, Coleco had to go to the arcade companies who owned the properties, because they were trademarked and they were patented, and get the rights for whatever category we were working on, handhelds, miniature tabletop, whatever. We had to get the rights to do them for the home market. And that also included doing software that played on the Atari and the Intellivision machines. So we had the rights to games for those machines, and we had a nice little business going for just doing, software, just doing games under the Coleco name. So here comes Arnold Greenberg at a product meeting, which we had fairly regularly, and he says, I really think that we should stop competing only in the game or software market. I think there's room for us to get into hardware in the console market with a new system that will have a console that's more powerful, better sound, better graphics, better animation than Intellivision or Atari. And I think we should establish ourselves as a total system manufacturer. That became ColecoVision, the concept. And we will then have our own system that'll be state-of-the-art because it's another generation, more powerful than the existing systems out there. And this was to create, I guess, an 8-bit system at that point. And what do you guys think? And a very bright marketing guy, Al Kahn, who worked with me, and the head of engineering and manufacturing, a guy named Mark Yosoloff and a guy named Eric Bromley, both very good, especially Mark Yosoloff, who went on to become the head of Shuffle Master, a Las Vegas-based public company that made all kinds of equipment for the gaming business, which was one of his first loves other than Coleco. All of us thought Arnold was crazy, that we couldn't compete and we couldn't have the money to compete and establish a console system that would compete with Intellivision and Atari. So Arnold Greenberg, very bright, didn't care. He said, do it. And it turns out he was right. And we came out with ColecoVision. We came out with a good library of arcade titles. And we got the rights to, or already had the rights to Donkey Kong. And they were not, it was not a product that was being offered for the home market by us, Coleco, or anyone else. So we decided, and this has become a strategy in the category forever, we decided that the way to launch ColecoVision as a console and as a system was to pack in Donkey Kong, which would be the first time that Donkey Kong was available to the home market. And so ColecoVision was introduced with Donkey Kong packed in. You had to buy ColecoVision to be able to play Donkey Kong at home. 6 months later, we introduced a version for Intellivision and Atari. But up till that point, 6 months after ColecoVision's introduction, you could only play Donkey Kong at home if you bought the new ColecoVision system. A pretty smart move and smart insight on the part of Arnold Greenberg.
Oh, I was going to ask, now you're developing a lot of product at Coleco at this point. So you've got the handhelds, you've got the mini arcades, and you've got the console software productions. How much of this is being done with Coleco's own internal engineering and programming staff? How much of this has to be farmed out? Because I can just imagine that this is a lot of product at one time. Coleco was a company, like you said, on the verge of bankruptcy. Obviously, big success that first year with their football game. But are you able to ramp up the internal production fast enough for all these products, or are you really using a lot of outside vendors for the production?
Good question. Upper New York State in the, let me get this right, in the early 70s, and before had been the bastion for the carpet, as in rug and carpet industry in the United States. And Coleco, when that industry went kaput and a lot of stuff started being made out of out of the country, the assistant governor of New York State was looking for some way to employ the labor force in upper New York State that had been a carpet labor force, employ them in some way using conversions of the factories in upper New York State, and I'm trying to remember the name of the town, if there were any companies that wanted to take over their factories and try to convert the factories as needed into factories for the kind of products that the new companies were making. To their credit, Leonard Greenberg, the older brother, who was an engineer by background, jumped on it because the state of New York gave all kinds of financial benefits to companies that would help the old carpet industry. And we took over some major factories, or Coleco did, for different kinds of Coleco products in upper New York State. And eventually, from making ride-ons that are plastic and the pools for the backyard that were plastic and games that were plastic, tabletop, games, non-electronic, the decision was made for all the Coleco electronic product to start making some of it in the upper New York State factory, because up until then, all the manufacturing was being done in the Orient. And was it supervised in any way by Coleco? You bet. Coleco had full-time employees that lived in the factory towns in China and supervised the marketing of the Coleco electronics products. So it became a two-pronged process, overseas, the Orient, and upper New York State. And that was a pretty good move on the part of Coleco also. Did that answer your question?
That answers my question. Well, as far as the manufacturer, what about the programming? Did you guys have a team of internal? Did you separate between engineers and programmers at this point?
The engineering department, yes, we did. So there were programmers and a whole group to do the programming of the games, and there was engineering that worked on the console, which was ColecoVision or the handhelds. So it was an electrical engineering group, whereas at Mattel, it was much broader because Mattel was a full-fledged toy company. At Coleco, the engineering group for electronics was the key engineering group. And the programming group was the programming group. I don't remember if we used outside conversion groups, conversion houses, development groups for software that did the conversions, of a Frogger or of a Donkey Kong, for the different tabletops and ColecoVision product and all that. I don't remember whether the conversions, and the conversions from arcade to the home system and then to the other, tabletop. I don't remember whether that was all done by Coleco, programmers, or whether we used some outside programmers to do that. But all of this forgets, Karl, a little product called Cabbage Patch. And,
that's true, I forgot.
Through the wisdom of Brian Clark and Al Kahn, who were keeping their eye on successful conventional toy and doll products around the world, somebody knew about Cabbage Patch, a very specially made fashion doll that sold for up to $200 per doll in a small factory in southern Georgia, where there was a guy who created the whole fantasy concept of dolls being born in a cabbage patch and being little kids, Cabbage Patch kids, because they came out of cabbages, and each one had their own identity. Each one had their own costumes and outfits, and in effect, the Cabbage Patch kids became the kids, the children of doll owners aged anywhere from 6 or 7 years old up to 70. So whether it was Al Kahn or Brian Clark, they fight about it. They made a trip down to see the founder of Cabbage Patch and offer him a nice advance and royalty for letting Coleco become the mass market, lower priced licensor and make Cabbage Patch Kids, Cabbage Patch Dolls, Preemies, the whole works, a mass market product sold through toy channels worldwide. 1982, thanks to ColecoVision and Cabbage Patch, Coleco the company, stock went from $7 a share to $50, which was a big deal in those days.
And a big deal for your options.
And it was the fastest growing stock on the New York Stock Exchange in 1982 or 83. I forget which.
Wow. ColecoVision does get distribution outside of North America, I believe through CBS. Were you involved at all in the licensing agreement for that? And what was the view of a company like Coleco, or even for that matter Mattel, of the non-North American markets at that time? Were they at all important? Were they prohibitively expensive to market in? Were they just not generating enough, or were they actually something that you kept an eye on as far as product development and so forth?
Good question. Coleco had a pretty strong personal and professional association with key distributors in Europe. I don't know how broad it was other than Europe, but definitely in Europe and Canada. Actually, Brian Clark, who ran Coleco Canada, which was a division, became the president of Coleco for a while, North America. So there were definitely individuals running in all the key countries, maybe 4 or 5 of them. And I guess it was South America, Central America, and Europe were running Coleco divisions. And they were listened to and they were important, especially France, Germany, the UK, to the Greenberg brothers. And they had long-term relationships with some of these distributors. So that's how it worked. I was not involved with that, other than we made product presentations when we had new products to all of those guys. And I don't believe they created any product that was unique to their countries. So they were basically taking the product from Coleco, North America, and doing the translations on the packaging and whatever had to be translated, commercials, and all of that, but not creating their own product.
Okay. And one other question I had, because the ColecoVision, and this was one of the things that I remember as a kid, the ColecoVision had an expansion so you could play Atari 2600 games on it. Or at least I remember this in advertising, and that did cause a bit of a spat with Atari. Do you remember how the idea came about to add that capability to the machine, and what the effect was?
I vaguely remember that some people, and I don't know if it was Arnold or other people, thought that having compatibility with other cartridges would encourage people who were Atari or Intellivision users to buy ColecoVision because of the convenience. And I never really got behind this because I didn't think it was too inconvenient to have more than one system as a consumer. But other people did because of the software, all the wires, the hardware wires and all that. The argument was it would be an added benefit. And I forget whether you put it into the port for ColecoVision or whether it was an attachment unit. But there was a feeling that the convenience factor would encourage 2600, Atari 2600 owners to trade up because they could do away with the clutter and the wires and all the mess physical mess of having more than one system. I don't know if you buy that or not, Karl, but that was the argument.
I can see it. When I look back on it, my initial reaction is, of course, that it's somewhat an effect of the model at the time, the pre-Nintendo model of you make your money off the cartridges because there's a licensing system, and Coleco obviously did not have a licensing system for the software yet. And that would be my final question about the ColecoVision. What was the math as far as how much profit you had to make off the console, or were you really already calculating that it was a razors and the blades type of business?
The latter, and I think every hardware company, basically makes no profit, whether it's, Microsoft or Sony or Nintendo, makes no or very little profit on the hardware. And they get it all from software that they've created internally and market internally as publishers, or what they collect in licensing fees and royalties from developers who have to pay a royalty.
Yeah. Okay. And did you guys have any direct or indirect relationships with any, or there were third parties creating games for the Coleco, if I remember correctly. I think Sierra made a few games for it. Did you guys have any direct relationships or any technical support for anybody developing third party for the system, or were they on their own if they were going to release any games?
They had to sign an agreement, which has been true of, how it's worked with every company, and pay a royalty to Coleco. There was a close relationship with a lot of the arcade companies because of the fact that Coleco had been selling the software independently before they even decided to get into ColecoVision. So we had to get the rights for the home systems from the likes of Williams in Chicago. A guy named Ken Podesna ran their division. And there were at least 4 or 5 arcade manufacturers in the U.S., and some, obviously, since we had Pac-Man, which was Namco, I believe. So Namco was important. Williams was important. I just don't remember. Bandai might have been one.
Nintendo, obviously.
I don't think Nintendo, because Nintendo had certain development groups captive, and those groups and companies in Japan, those groups were on an exclusive with Nintendo, which became the basis of the suit. There were 2 suits for monopolistic practices by Sega and Atari, and by later Sega and Atari, or Atari alone, against Nintendo for monopolistic practices. I think you're familiar with that. If you're not,
oh yeah, no,
you should
definitely
read Stephen Kent. Yeah, right.
Oh no, yes,
I don't.
The famous Jack Tramel's cutting costs on lawyers and a suit that almost would have worked, and actually forcing Nintendo to expand in Europe because they were afraid that they were going to lose market share in North America if they were found to be a monopoly, or as part of the story, at least.
Nintendo hired the highest priced, best known business law firm in San Francisco, and to defend the suit against them. And the claim was that Nintendo had a 95% share of market against Atari and Sega because of the fact that they had exclusives with the hottest arcade game companies that were Japanese. That was their defense in Ninth Circuit Federal Court. The claims made by Sega and Atari, and I testified, as well as a lot of people involved in the suits. The defense was Jack Tramiel spent no money, wouldn't give Michael Katz or the marketing area any money to make them a real force against Nintendo in terms of the business side and the marketing side. Therefore, Atari took a back seat, and Sega took a back seat to Nintendo. Not because Nintendo had an advantage from the arcade titles, but because they spent a hell of a lot more on marketing and were a lot more marketing savvy than Atari or Sega. And the court ruled in favor of that argument, by the way.
Yeah.
And so Sega and Atari lost the suit.
Oh, my goodness. Okay, but we're jumping, I think, a little bit ahead of ourselves, and that is a story. I didn't know that you testified on that one. So actually, sorry, the lawyer in me is going crazy right now. But we have a very, very important stop on your journey, Epyx. So why the decision to leave Coleco, and how do you end up at a computer software company?
I am divorced. I was divorced at the time. My two daughters lived in the Bay Area. So I started looking after a period of time at Coleco in cold West Hartford, Connecticut, snowy and cold, especially between the months of November and March. I had vested X amount of shares of stock, and the ride had been great, but the plan was always to get a presidency job or CEO job at some company in the Bay Area and return to, where my kids lived and the California that I loved. So I started looking or listening to opportunities that fit those qualifications, and I got contacted in the winter, I guess, of 1982 or 1983, whenever it was, by an executive search firm that basically represented the board of directors of a company called Epyx, which I had never heard of, also known as Strategic Simulations at one point. And they were looking for a president, and the company was in the Bay Area in Silicon Valley. The board members consisted of 6 of the leading venture capital firms in Northern California, including Mayfield, U.S. Venture Partners, Arthur Rock, who was an individual, very wealthy angel investor at the time. That's 3. There were 2 other leading venture capital firms. And so the board consisted of the founder of Epyx and these 5 firms. And Epyx was doing about $1.5 million that's dollars, in sales, and losing $400,000 a year. And they were very unidirectional. The guy, Jim Conley, who founded and ran the company and who would raise the money, was a extreme, very serious strategy games, PC strategy game player. The big product for Epyx was a game called Temple of Apshai, which is a mostly text-oriented adventure role-playing game. And the board said, we need someone who can expand the product line, compete in the mass market, in the console market, where volumes are great, marketing is important, against the likes of or in the market of the likes of Atari and Coleco and Mattel and Nintendo. And, would you, Michael Katz, be interested? And you'll like this story. I don't know if I've told it too much before, but I got a bunch of computer magazines because I'm not a computer guy. I'm not an engineer. I'm not particularly computer literate, and I don't know how to program. I got a bunch of PC magazines that were popular at the time, and looked at some of the ads that dealt with PC software and game software. And this was basically during the lull between the video game craze that ended briefly in the early 80s and the time that it came back strong in the late 80s. So I was on a cold November, January, February, whatever it was, night in my apartment with a fire going. The fire wouldn't start, and it wouldn't start in the fireplace. Okay. And then turning pages in this PC magazine, and I come to a page with an Epyx print ad, a horrible ad, but it was an Epyx print ad in a PC magazine. And at that moment, a spark burst in the fireplace, and the fire actually got started. And this was a sign from the heavens that Epyx should be taken seriously as an opportunity. So I came out to the West Coast. I interviewed. I saw that, I could help them. Any consumer products marketing guy, any console marketing guy could help them. And, I made a deal that had stock involvement, of course, in the CEO position. Epyx had about 30 or 40 employees and a small office in Sunnyvale. And they were going through money like crazy. The investors, I guess, were fed up with that. They were probably fed up with the pragmatism of the owner, not wanting to be a mass market toy and video game type guy, but wanting to continue to be this esoteric PC computer game guy. And so it wasn't easy from a internal political standpoint to get the company changed in their way of thinking. But in 6 months, probably one of the most gratifying things I've been involved with, we made the company into a mass market oriented computer game company by introducing several categories and starting a category called Kids Action Games, as demonstrated by the product Pit Stop. Not Kids Action, I'm sorry. Action strategy games. And the idea was to maintain the strategy following of gamers that Epyx had, but add action elements visually and in gameplay to new computer games like Pit Stop, which demonstrated action strategy in that the action was driving a car around the track and trying to beat the other cars and win the game. But the strategy element, as you know well, was keep an eye on your tire wear, which was reflected in the game, and your gas gauge, and determine as you're racing the other cars whether you were going to go into the pits and then have your cursor and controller put on the pit crew, changing the tires, gassing up the car, getting back on the track. Did you want to take the time to do that and ultimately get back on the track and beat the other cars? Or did you want to risk not going into the pit and seeing if you could win with the gas and tire wear that you had?
Yeah.
That was action strategy. That was my idea, to try to hold on to the strategy-oriented game players that Epyx and Temple of Apshai had generated, but to bring in some video game type players who wanted more action. And to demonstrate that in packaging and image, it was our idea to get Rodin, the thinker, put a joystick in his hand and make that the image standing for action strategy games. So we completely redid the packaging in black and silver, which has always been my favorite, to communicate electronic product. We had the image of Rodin with the joystick on all the packaging, all the advertising, print advertising that we did. We got Chiat Day, Apple's ad agency, because I knew Jay Chiat, and he agreed. We became their first computer game client at the time that they were making Apple into the famous company it became. And we had a great PR firm, and we had at Toy Fair 6 months later, not Toy Fair, the Winter CES show in Las Vegas, we had 5 product categories, including educational games, action strategy games, and I forget what the other categories were. And we generated 6 months after we made the change in the image of the company, we generated $7 million in sales and a profit from $1.5 million and a loss. And at that CES show, I wanted our booth located near Coleco to get the traffic that I knew was going to be brought to Coleco, because Coleco was, a hot company in the early 80s, and they were about to introduce a computer that turned out not to be a real computer. It was just a prototype that never went anywhere. Do you remember the name of it?
It wasn't the Atom, was it? No.
It was the Atom.
It was the Atom. Yes.
So I knew all the analysts and all the writers who covered the industry would be coming to the Coleco booth, and they would be wowed by the prospect of Atom, not knowing that the engineering was about 30% done. It would never meet the price point that was necessary, but it would get everyone and all the attention over to Coleco, and I could keep my eye on their booth and determine when I was going to actually execute all my stock options during the show to try to get the best possible price. And I was off by $5, unfortunately, or $10, because I didn't know when they were having their analyst meeting, which I think was about 2 days after the CES show started. And the analyst meeting generated a $10 more bump in the stock. And I had sold the day before, but I can't complain.
No. You still made away like a
so I had a few interests at the show to, of course, introduce the new Epyx and hopefully get a big excitement behind it, but also to keep my eye on what was going at the Coleco booth.
That really would have been something to watch. Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, Epyx is a whole different ballgame. It's almost exclusively a computer software company. Well, when you come in, it is exclusively a computer software company. While you're there, you do release a handful of ports of games to the ColecoVision, including, I believe, Pit Stop gets a ColecoVision port, correct? If I'm remembering correctly.
You mean Commodore, I think, don't you?
The Commodore 64 definitely gets one. The Atari 8-bit computers, but I think the Coleco also gets a version of Pit Stop. Yeah, there is a Coleco version of Pit Stop.
Not while I was there, but maybe maybe Bob Botch was the market. Yeah, but I left out. You're right. We made the decision at the urging of our board, and then taking a look, to acquire a company called StarPath, which was a group of programmers led by Bob Brown. Bob Brown is great. He was the head engineer at Atari, and he developed the 2600. He then went and started his own software development group called StarPath, about 20 guys. And some of our venture group on the board had also invested in StarPath. They were floundering. We were asked if we wanted to acquire StarPath. We did, about 7 or 8 people, including Bob Brown. And as part of the acquisition, we acquired a Olympic type game that was only halfway finished, that they weren't even touting. But the minute I saw it and we saw it at Epyx, it was perfect, because the Olympics was coming up. Summer Olympics was coming up about a year later. And we thought if we could get the license, or if we needn't have the license, we could make an Olympic game that had 7 or 8 events, which was what, Bob Brown's game was aimed at. So it was a real value-oriented, perfect action-oriented game with the Olympic title, Summer Games, we ended up calling it, which we were allowed to do at that point. If you tried to do it now, you wouldn't be able to, because the Olympic Committee goes after anyone who has any name that has anything to do with the Olympics. I do not think we had to pay any kind of a license to the Olympics for it. And then we did Winter Games afterwards and California Games. But that was a great franchise. That came out of Starpath. Jumpman, which you love, was an independent development designer named Randy Glover, if I remember right.
Yes.
And he brought the game to Epyx, and we bought the game from him, paid him a royalty, advance guarantee, and royalty. We had 3 or 4 terrific programmers, the Nelson brothers and others, who were programmers at Epyx that either we brought in or were there when I got there, and they developed some very good games. And we instituted a royalty compensation in addition to salary, a royalty compensation which was pretty unheard of. I think they might have had one at Electronic Arts, but not as generous. And it was that anyone who developed an original game at Epyx would get, I think it was around 3% of sales revenue as their royalty directly to the developer, because the games became property of Epyx, but we wanted the developers to be rewarded for having developed the games. So the guys who had Summer Games, Winter Games, Jumpman, and others did rather well. They got their salary on top of that. And, we were offering a very fair compensation system. On conversions from one system to another, if you took Jumpman or Pit Stop and made it, from the Commodore 64, converted it to Apple or IBM, there was also a royalty, a smaller one, maybe 1%, connected or given to the guys who did the conversion.
Yeah, makes sense. Now, and just from...
I forgot to tell you, in Europe, to your point before, in Europe, we did an exclusive with a guy named Jeff Smith, who's well known in software circles in Europe. Jeff Smith had founded a distributorship out of the UK called US Games, and he was trying to offer games from all the American computer game publishers. He tried to become the exclusive distributor for all those lines in Europe, and his leading line became Epyx because we were impressed by his marketing clout, connections, and know-how. So he got the distribution rights, at least when I was at Epyx, for all of Europe, and did a pretty good job.
Yeah, US Gold, not US Games, US Gold.
I'm sorry, you're right, US Gold, correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Now, and what was that kind of deal like? Because obviously the European systems also had stuff like the ZX Spectrum and the Amstrad and the MSX. Was Epyx furnishing ports to those systems, or did US Gold have the right to port the Commodore 64 and Atari games over to those systems?
I don't know the answer. I either don't remember or don't know.
No problem. It's a long time ago. Now, the Epyx is obviously a slightly different business model from what you knew over at Coleco, because number one, you're doing software on a diskette or cassette, so you, for the most part, there was some cartridge product, but it was mostly diskette. So how did that much cheaper medium impact the marketing decisions, the number of products you were releasing, and so forth? Or did it have no impact at all?
In terms of, you mean charging a lot but making a much bigger profit because the cost of goods was a lot less?
No. Well, I'm thinking a couple of different things. Number one, lead times on production were smaller, so were you more flexible in being able to react to retailer demand? Was it easier to store the product because of the way that it was manufactured and the space it took up? And did it also give you more flexibility in pricing the product? So, I mean, if you have a cartridge, you've got certain fixed costs in the production that can never be reduced. Whereas with software, you can always go further and further down until you hit that basic price of the diskette and the packaging. So was there more flexibility on the pricing decisions, more flexibility on how quickly you could service retailer demand and so forth?
Manufacturing was easy because it was just duplicating a disk.
Yeah.
So at Epyx, we did our own manufacturing and warehousing in the back of the headquarters building. And I remember Fred Goldberg, who's a friend of mine now, who was the head of Chiat Day in San Francisco, came to visit Epyx after we became their first client in this area. And he was taken into the, quote, manufacturing facility, and there were 3 people just putting discs into sleeves and shipping them out the door. And, he had never seen a manufacturing facility that simplistic and that basically simple, in his life. So he put it in a book that he wrote, by the way. So
oh, wow.
that was comical. So that's how we could react, you're right, and there was not a big cost of manufacturing, but the pricing was controlled by the market. So we had to price our products at whatever the range, and I don't even remember the range of what Electronic Arts or Microprose or Spectrum Holobyte or Data East or those guys were selling their game software at. So I think it seemed like a lot. Certainly versus conventional toy and game products, and maybe a lot versus the cartridge that you got from, Atari or Intellivision or ColecoVision. But I just don't remember what I think it was high priced. Could it have been around $29 or $39?
I was going to say the price I remember seeing usually at a Sears or a Fred Meyer's was $29.95 was the typical price for an Epyx game back in the day.
Yeah, when PC games, as you know, got dumped, they got dumped for like $3.99 and $4.99, and anyhow, you didn't want to have a product like that.
No, definitely not. Now, Epyx, obviously, you were talked about the rebranding, and yes, the Thinker with the joystick is in my head, especially since Summer Games, you had all the different countries, and one of the countries was Epyx with their own little theme song and a flag with the Thinker on it. But I've always had this question. That standardized art style for the covers that sort of looked like it was just a white line drawing with a laser effect coming off of it that was used for everything from Impossible Mission to Pit Stop to Jumpman Jr. and Summer Games. Was that designed by your advertising agency? Was that something that was done internally? How did that look come about?
Starting with Epyx, when I became president, I had control over who got selected as various suppliers. And in some cases, when I was just in charge of marketing, I could do that also. But starting, one of the benefits of being a CEO or president is you can control, if you want to, who does certain things as outside suppliers or contractors. And since my bent is marketing, I had established a community of people, whether they be in package design or naming or advertising or, videotapes for sales meetings or infomercials. I had my little group that I liked, had worked with, and were reasonably priced. And one of them was a single independent package design guy with offices in Melvin Belli's building. You probably remember the name, being an attorney. Melvin was a hotshot, flashy lawyer in San Francisco for 30 years, who had an office that basically had a store window on Montgomery Street in San Francisco, across from the fanciest restaurant, and Melvin Belli's desk was sitting behind the window, so everyone could see the famous Melvin Belli, and it was a mess. It had, thousands of law books and files and folders and all that. So upstairs he had one little studio that was inhabited by Paul Rupert, R-U-P-E-R-T, who, when I joined Foremost in 1969, was one of the independent package designers that Foremost was using for some of their dairy products. So I became friendly with Paul, and over the years, Paul was called upon to do various projects, and one of them was to do the whole repackaging project of Epyx and give it a high-tech black and silver look. And, being a packaged goods, grocery products marketing guy, we had copy strategies in writing that emphasized what elements would have the most importance on the package front and back. And so that directed how large the Epyx should be, where the image of the thinker should be, how large the brand name should be, what kind of contrast should there be between the different names in the background and all that. So Paul created the look, and it gave Epyx a unique, hopefully high quality, high tech look, and it was uniform. It wasn't different for each product. The only thing that differed was the artwork on the front and maybe the color or treatment of the name of the individual game.
Yeah, it was an amazing look. I mean, for years I've been trying to figure out who actually did it. So Paul Rupert, I'm going to actually have to look him up, because it's been dogging me for years, and I've never been able to get an answer about who did it. Because I love those
Unfortunately, Unfortunately, he died, 5 or 6 or 7 years ago. But hopefully, if you research Paul Rupert, R-U-P-E-R-T, you might find him. But he was very low key and old school, and was never after publicity. And but he was good, and he was a good friend. Anyhow, so where were we?
Yes. Okay, so we have the packaging. We've got this new line of action strategy mixture games. There's one more line of games at Epyx that I really am interested in finding out about. There were 3 titles. There were several titles that used acquired licenses. You had the 9-to-5 typing program, which I always thought was a weird little oddity, but quite entertaining and a good typing program. But there were also 3 based off of toy lines. There was a Hot Wheels, a G.I. Joe, and a Barbie.
Oh, okay, good. In the educational category, we also had fun with math, and I think fun with what it had been reading. We wanted to have an educational category. We wanted to be in the Broderbund Learning Company arena in a minor way, just to show that we had a broad line of product. It never became a big deal because none of those educational products for any of the companies became a big deal in distribution or in consumption. And I was interviewed all over the world, not all over. In those days, whenever I was interviewed, I was asked about the category. And to anyone who was in the category as a publisher, the answer was the same. Why is a kid, after 8 hours of school, 7 or 8 or 9-year-old, why is he going to come home and spend 2 hours, playing a computer game that had to do with education? He wasn't. She wasn't. So it was never a big category.
And
okay,
how about
so
the toy
but I evaded your question.
Yeah, sorry. I was always curious how that came about.
I forgot. We created a category which was a category at Mattel, in terms of terminology. And that category was, not games, not activity toys. Thank you. Activity toys. And what activity toys were, Karl, at Mattel, and also I picked it up at Epyx, were an opportunity for children, boys or girls, to go through a play pattern that didn't have winning as its objective. So these were not games. They were activity toys. And that's what they were called at Mattel. So toy soldiers, for example, or it could have been Hasbro, they fit into activity toys where you're actually playing with your soldiers, creating your own activity, but not a game that had to have winning and losing and game type strategy. Or Hot Wheels or Matchbox, where you're playing with cars and you're creating your own play environment, but not, a game where there's winning and losing involved. Or G.I. Joe, where you're G.I. Joe, a soldier, leading a squad of soldiers, doing different things, but not a winning and losing situation. And Barbie, where you are dressing Barbie, putting makeup on Barbie, getting her ready for a dance or a party, but no winning or losing is involved. So it occurred to me that for the activity toy category, we should try to get the hottest activity toy products in the toy industry so we'd have built-in awareness. And a lot of people never knew this, never gave us credit for this, but, Epyx was the first video game, computer game company ever to get a license from Hasbro, G.I. Joe, or from Mattel, Barbie and Hot Wheels. And if I can toot our horn a little, that was done because I had the contacts. And, when Steve Hassenfeld ran Hasbro, I went to summer camp in Maine when I was a kid for 7 years, and Steve and Alan Hassenfeld went to the same summer camp. So I knew them. And I had been at I had been at Mattel, and so all I had to do was call up the marketing director, Rita Fire in the case of Barbie, and Mike Lydon, I guess, in the case of Hot Wheels. They were the marketing directors or vice presidents and friends of mine at Mattel on Hot Wheels and on Barbie. So I got the license for Epyx, little Epyx, and we had Barbie, Hot Wheels, and G.I. Joe. And, so thank you for asking about activity toys. That was one of our six categories at Epyx.
I played G.I. Joe to death with my friends. It was the birth of one-on-one death match in an arena. And you could play it again and again and again. It wasn't suddenly, okay, the game is over. And it took me by surprise the first time I played it because I was like, wait, it's not over? Oh, the Cobra guy got out again. Okay, well, the game keeps going. And it really was an innovative product that it had a different paradigm. It took me a second to get used to it, but once I did, literally we just kept playing for hour and hour on end, and it was amazing. So yes, and I was always curious how that came about with different companies.
I'm delighted to hear it.
Okay, it's getting late, and there's so much more yet to say. We're going to leave it right there, and then let's do a part 2. When we come back, we'll find out why you end up leaving Epyx and where you end up going next, and, well, what Nintendo don't. So, Mike, thank you so much for your time. Really, this has been an extremely educational conversation, and the people listening to this didn't hear the last, actually, hour and a half of our conversation about completely different things. Actually, we could have recorded the rest of the whole thing, but this was far more entertaining. So, everybody, there will be a part 2 of our interview here with Michael Katz. Michael, any final words before we shut this half of the conversation down?
If you and all your listeners have games that have as their goal the solution to the current coronavirus situation, then I think you're providing a wonderful service, Karl. But short of that, I've enjoyed talking to you. Thanks for rocking my memory back 40 years. It was fun replaying a lot of those fun times, and I'll look forward to talking to you again.
Okay, perfect. Okay, and with that being said, everybody stay safe out there.